Today we're going to start with perceiving music. So the next part of it's under the sound organization in the book, but how we perceive music, which is, I'll go ahead which is considered to be organized sound. And we might think of, well, dogs barking and lawnmowers going and the refrigerator and the noises, they are somewhat organized as well. So what do we really mean by organized sound? We really kind of organize it in a number of ways. One is along the vertical part of the staff when I talk about melody, and we're going to be talking about how those pitches, those pitches hang together in a way that they seem to belong together. And then along the horizontal part of the staff is really the timing, the rhythm, the meter, the accent of whatever we are listening to. And so I have here the Three Blind Mice example from the example from familiarity of, if I know that you're singing three blind mice, and then even if it's jumping around, I can recognize that. But you can imagine, so this melody is, there are a sequence of pitches, and we hear that as belonging together in a melody. And they really separate out into phrases. So even if we aren't musicians, we have this tendency to separate melodies into these shorter segments. And you can see one of the things that happens is there is a larger pitch change between phrases usually than there is within a phrase. And you can see this in the Three Blind Mice. So Three Blind Mice, those are all maybe two semitones away. And let me just do the semitones is, if I go C, C sharp, that's one semitone. C sharp, D, that's one semitone. D, D sharp, that's one semitone. And so E down to D down to C, each of those is two semitones away from each other. And then as we pop back up to E from that C, so that first piece is a phrase, and we go back up to E, and you can see there's a larger change in pitch, and that's pretty typical of how phrases work. The other thing we see is that there are longer pauses at the end of the phrase or between the phrases than within the phrases. So Three Blind Mice, there's that half note, so that's held for 2 beats. Three Blind Mice, three blind, those are quarter notes, they're held for 1 beat. And then mice on the C again, I'm hoping I'm leading you along there. That's held for 2. Actually, I think it's 3 in this one, so that's 1.5 and 1.5. They have the little dots after. So between phrases, or really at the end of the phrase, we have this tendency to have a longer note there, which that actually matches in what we do with language as well. So we're trying to distinguish between the phrases and the pieces. We'll have a bit of a pause. And when we ask about how we create a particular melody, this is really referring to how we are grouping those sequences of pitches. And this is often referred to as auditory stream integration. And so you can bring it back to some of those Gestalt principles, because we talked about similarity of timbre and pitch. Well, really what we were doing was the segregation of, if they were different in timbre and pitch, we tended to segregate them. If they're similar in timbre and pitch, we're gonna tend to integrate them. So this auditory stream integration, creating the single melody, which we did a little bit of this in class. So those smaller intervals, so proximity is really important as we're getting similar pitches and pitches that are close to each other. Those large pitch intervals, we don't tend to have those within a melody very often, and when we do, they tend to go up and then have this gap fill. So these smaller pitch intervals that are coming back down, filling in the gap. And the example he gives there is Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and another book gives My Bonnie Sailed Over the Ocean. Those I'm not going to sing either of them because they're kind of out of my pitch range, but they both have that. If you think about how they work, they're going from a low pitch to a pretty high pitch, and then they're filling in as they descend down into these pitch intervals that are pretty close to each other again. We have really rules almost about tonality, and especially in Western music, this applies, and in a lot of music, a lot of this applies. But if you start getting into world musics, different cultures and their music, there are differences. But so for Western music especially, a song that begins on tonic is going to end on tonic. And what tonic means is if I'm in the key of C, C is tonic. If I'm in the key of F, F is tonic. And we tend to begin and end on that characteristic note of the key. And there is a tonal hierarchy. Certain tones are going to fit in better within those melodies, with tonic being the best. And there's a great figure, 1226, that shows people ranking. So I think the researchers played either a scale or maybe some arpeggios within a certain key. And then they test tonic. Tonic is rated, I think, from, if I remember correctly, it's from 0 to 7, of 7 being the best fit. Tonic is high up there, near 7. Then the next ones are the major third and the perfect fifth. And then we get into the second, the fourth, the sixth, and the seventh. So things that are in the key but are not the major third or the perfect fifth. So in the key of C, that would be E and G. They fit in better, and people rate them as fitting in better. And then when we get to those other notes that are still in the key, like D, F, A, and B, there's a little bit of bouncing around, but they all fit in about the same. And then when we get into those notes that are outside of the key, so C sharp, D sharp, and those ones that don't fit in the key of C, then we see these lower ratings. So that's the tonal hierarchy, according to Carol Krumhansel, who's done a lot of this work. And Krumhansel has also statistically analyzed compositions by famous composers. They give the examples in the book. I should have probably looked this up, and I don't want to go back now. But I'm pretty sure Mozart's in there, maybe Mendelssohn, and one other. And she found a 0.89 correlation with tonal hierarchies. So these ratings of what people are saying, that's also what statistically, well, that's also what composers tend to use. But if you notice that to some extent that is confounded in that most of our music is based off of those Western composers and basing things on tonic, and so that's what we've heard the most, and so that's what we are familiar with, and familiarity is key in all of this. But even if we take that out and look at infants before they've learned much about music, it looks like there is still some amount of tonal hierarchy. It's not as strong, but definitely tonic is preferred, and then the major third and the perfect fifth. And tonality is sometimes talked about as a musical syntax. So if you think about the structures of our sentences, and that there's a certain structure required, that this is really applying that idea of structural integrity, grammar, well, syntax, not so much grammar, but syntax to music itself. So Osterhout et al. In 1997, they were looking at language, and they were looking at ERPs in response to syntactic violations of language. And so if you look over at the figure on the right, that is showing you the electrical signal. And if you look at the cats won't eat, the blue line, eat is where the 0 millisecond mark is. And so this is what you see as the blue line is really what we're going to call normal processing. And then the cats won't eating, well, eating is a syntactic violation. And what we see is about 600 milliseconds out, there is this positivity, which is marked there with the P. And I know it's upside down. You can see in the y-axis, it's upside down. It's just how ERP literature sometimes works. But so we have this positive going waveform at 600 milliseconds out. Well, Patel et al. Examined ERPs in response to basically syntactic violations in music. And the figure 1228 is very telling. It really shows almost a very similar looking figure to this. So in the key is we have the quote normal going waveform. This is all not a syntactic violation. in the key. I think if it's in the key, but it's not the chord that's kind of being led to. No, I think it's close to key. Close to key, we have a bit of a P600, and it's right around 600 milliseconds. And then they have farther from the key. So they have another chord that is really not in the key, and we have an even larger P600 basically to that. So this is really showing somewhat a similarity between how we are processing those violations of syntax and music in this case, to the syntax and language. And another thing that's being set up with tonality is a kind of often an emotional response. So we utilize regularities in the environment, just like we saw with vision and with object recognition, these kind of semantic regularities, except for now it's in our music. Familiar songs are related to emotional responses, and whether we like the song or we don't like the song, it looks like if we have some emotional, if it's familiar, we have an emotional response, and they can see that in the fMRIs, in our brain activity. And when we have these kind of violations, so we often can set up an expectation of what the next note's going to be as we maybe dance around and act like we're going to come back to tonic, and then we violate that expectation. That's another way that music causes emotion. And this is the kind of emotional response that Leonard Meyer is talking about in his book, Emotion and Meaning in Music. So if you're really interested in this kind of thing, Leonard Meyer is a great person to read. David Huron is the one underneath that. He's a really great researcher in this field as well, looking at the emotional responses to music and to melody. And I do have a link up there, which I will provide, but you don't need to watch. It's just if you really enjoy that kind of how music plays with your expectation and how that causes emotional responses, this guy is playing some Chopin and talking from that and explaining how Chopin really, really utilizes that very well. Okay, and so that is what was really repeated from what we did on the Wednesday before break. Now we're going to move on to musical organization and the aspect of rhythm. So really the melody, or a lot of the aspects of melody and those frequencies, are the manipulation of how music is organized by frequency, by pitch. But now we're going to look along what I was referring to before as kind of the x-axis, right? As we're going across horizontally along this, what he gives us here is the beginning of the Star-Spangled Banner. As we're moving along horizontally, music also is organized in time, and rhythm is the time pattern of the durations created by notes. So really, it's the onset of the different notes, the onset time of the different notes. And so I'm going to do this. Try to make this rhythm as I can. It goes eighth, eighth, quarter, 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 half, eighth, eighth, quarter, 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 half, eighth, eighth, like that. And he gives us the blue dots as a kind of, this is the rhythm of this song. He then talks about the beat as the pulse of music. So if we look over at our figure, at our treble clef there and our flats, we have a 3/4 time, which tells us about the beat or the pulse of music. And it's going to have a 1, 2, 3, as we have 3 beats per measure. And that's the kind of feel of the song. And so what we typically do is this 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And as you might know, this is the feeling and the meter of a waltz. And so when I do the beat, I almost have to do the meter. And so if you look down at the bottom, he, with the red arrows, is giving us the beat of this 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, trying to do it without the meter. And the meter is taking into account those red asterisks, that what we tend to do is a 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 in this kind of triple meter where the accent is on the first beat of the measure. Okay, we also have a duple meter when we go 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And this kind of march, more of a march kind of feel than a waltz kind of feel. And again, this is all really the pulse of music. He mentions how when we are tapping our toe or moving our hand to music, we're probably doing this to the beat of music. I often feel like I'm moving to some extent to the rhythm of music, as we're going to see in the very next slide. Our basal ganglia are very active when we're listening to music, as we are, even when we are not moving ourselves, our brain is responding as if we are moving to some extent. So Braun and Rowe in 2009 found a connection between beat and the activity of the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia are these subcortical structures that are responding to our they're responding to our voluntary decision to make a movement. They often, what they'll do is they'll sort of take over a lot of the habitual kind of, this is what we typically sort of do. So when we're talking about activity in subcortical structures, this is usually activity that we're not aware of, right? So it's kind of this unconscious part of our processing. And what they found was that the basal ganglia and the connections between the basal ganglia and some of the cortical areas, so as we get up into the cerebral cortex, some of those cortical motor areas, those connections are more active when we're listening to a beat condition compared to where we're listening to a non-beat condition. And so a couple of things about what I'm saying about this figure. I went and looked this up because I thought, how did they make a non-beat condition? No matter what you do, you're going to have some kind of beat in there. We can't, it's really difficult for us to create a non-beat, but they truly did go in with a computer that randomized the non-beat so that there would not be a beat. The other thing that I want to clarify here is that I looked up this picture because it was really odd to me that the basal ganglia are in the front of the head and the motor areas are in the back of the head, and that's not the way that looks. Okay, the basal ganglia are down. So this slice through the head that's kind of idealized here is actually a diagonal slice. Okay, the basal ganglia are down, they are subcortical areas, and those blue balls that are representing the motor areas, they're much farther forward than they look, because again, this is a diagonal slice. In another study by, I think it was Iverson and Patel, they had participants listen to what you can see in A is there would be sound bursts that would be short, long, short, long, short, long. This was counterbalanced so that sometimes they started out with long, long, short, long, short, long, short. And then they would have people listen to these and ask them what they perceived. One of the aspects of the rhythm of music that we notice is that if you look across cultures and across different musical styles, that the rhythm of the music, the patterning of the music, is very much influenced by the rhythm and patterning of the language. And so if we look at English speakers, our language tends to go short, long in its pattern. So the book, to eat, the dog, and so forth. If we look at Japanese speakers, their language goes in the opposite direction typically. So he gives us the example, I don't really speak Japanese, but he gives us the example honga. So honga is the book, where hon is book, and the modifier, the determiner there is ga, and so it comes after. So it has a long, short kind of patterning or rhythm. So they had people listen to these, and they were either English speakers or Japanese speakers. And if you can see in the figures in B that English speakers tended to perceive this as short, long, more so than Japanese. Japanese speakers were more likely than English speakers to perceive long, short. Usually here, I play a small amount of a Peter Gabriel CD that, so he had two compilations where he had a lot of people from all over the world help him with his music, and then he went and produced a compact disc back in the day. He went and produced a compilation of them playing their music. And I usually play something from the Middle East right now. I am going to look this up and provide a link on Blackboard if I can find something that works. Finally, in the Something to Consider section at the end, he discusses the interactions between vision and hearing. I'm actually going to talk about a slightly different study than the one he presents, but it's a similar kind of study, and you can see now 2 examples of how we see these interactions between vision and hearing, and they occur in both directions. And so I start out with this ventriloquism effect, and we're going to see this, we're about to do speech, and you'll see this in speech too, that we have a very strong kind of audio-visual kind of perception of speech, that our vision helps us a lot to understand when we are listening to someone talk, if we can see them. So one example is the ventriloquism effect of how strongly vision affects our interpretation of sound, and especially the localization of sound. So we have this kind of visual capture. The ventriloquism effect is if I am a ventriloquist and I have my dummy and I can keep my mouth still while I'm talking, and then I move the dummy's mouth, it sounds like, to people, it sounds like the sound is coming from the dummy's mouth. And we have this kind of visual capture. We've all experienced this in movie theaters as well. With movie theaters now, and you might even have a system at home where, if you can't appreciate that kind of how they're creating those sound localization cues, that it sounds like something's coming off from the left or from the right and behind you, that is really kind of cool. What's happening when the people are speaking on the screen, right? That information, that sound is still coming from the speakers. The people who are doing the speaking on the screen, they can be anywhere on the screen, and it sounds as if the sound is coming out of their mouths. And so that's kind of cool. So it has this really strong visual capture. So that's one influence of vision on our hearing and our perception of the auditory world. But we also see an effect of hearing and our auditory world on our interpretation of our visual worlds. And so this study comes from Secular et al. You can see, so what's happening in A and B in the visual world, the same exact thing is going to be happening on the screen. And in a no sound condition, what it appears like happens as these balls move on the screen is that the ball that's up at the left top corner moves down to the bottom right corner. The ball that's in the top right corner moves down to the bottom left corner. And they kind of just pass by each other. The only difference between A and B, again, the visual world is completely the same, is that in B, there's a click added right when those balls come together at the center. And so what people now perceive is that, I'm just going to do one side, where the ball at the right top corner, right, it comes down to the middle, it hits the left ball, and then goes back down to the bottom right. Okay, so the interactions between vision and hearing are very interesting. And this is the last slide of the PowerPoint. So again, welcome back, and we will do a little bit of speech today. I hope you all are feeling not only just safe and healthy, but not stressed about how everything is going to be changing quite a bit. I'm going to do my best to make this as easy as we possibly can, and as similar as we can to us actually being in class. So let me know if you have questions about material. You can email me, and as much as possible, I will answer questions at the beginning of the next PowerPoint for the next class. There will be times when I'll email you back, but I think not only so that it feels a little bit more like a class, but also so I'm not just emailing back and forth, that it would be nice to have a little bit of a question and answer section. And I know that sensation and perception has some complicated concepts in it. So do make sure that if you have questions, you are feeling comfortable about asking them, and not just about the material, but about the logistics as everything moves forward. All right.